It is a pretty well-known fact that the birth of most modern Middle Eastern nations are the product of European colonialism. The aftermath of the First World War granted European powers the ability to divide and distribute the remaining territory of the Ottoman Empire in a way that suited their own imperial aspirations. These countries would eventually achieve independence, but their entire existence continues to revolve around the decisions of their former European masters. The global order that these new nations found themselves in was in every way shaped and formed by Western imperialism. The borders, economies, governments, and societies that these states function with are both directly and indirectly an artificial product of Europe. As a result of this intentional division and conquest, the Middle East region, and particularly the Arab world, has been a place of intense instability. New countries that never existed before had to govern a population in the confinements of borders they didn't really believe in. Political ideologies such as communism, liberalism, nationalism, and secularism were dividing the minds and hearts of the Arab peoples who were just beginning to see themselves as a national identity. On top of all that, the Arab world is also home to the largest oil reserves on the planet and to the most important choke points of international trade, so conflict was of course inevitable. For Western empires, Arab subordination remains to be a top priority in maintaining global dominance, and in order to achieve that, thousands need to be killed and trillions need to be spent. By arming, financing, and initiating these conflicts, Western imperialism continues to this day to be the single most influential driver of the Arab world's instability, not just because of its direct actions, but also because the entire region was molded by its influence. From Israel and Palestine to Morocco and Western Sahara, to the civil wars in Algeria, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, the origins of these conflicts consistently come from Western empires, which have for over 100 years dominated the political landscape of the Arab world. Today, the region is notorious for its instability and wars, which have claimed the lives of millions and continues to negatively impact the wider world. Though mostly fought by Arabs and on Arab lands, it is the empires of the West that truly bear the most responsibility for the region's current conflicts. There is, however, one exception to this rule. You see, as influential as the European powers were, not every Arab country was directly shaped by their imperialism. There are, in fact, two Arab nations that managed to establish themselves as sovereign nations in spite of the overwhelming presence of European empires. Their histories would, of course, remain influenced by Western imperialism, but their destinies were, for the most part, forged on their own accords. It is the borders, politics, identities, and conflicts of these two nations that remain to be the least tainted by Western powers in the Arab world. And it is ironically their conflict that not only is the most destructive in the modern Arab world, but more tragically, the most forgotten. The dawn of the 19th century brought forth a new era in Middle Eastern history. The once invincible Ottoman Empire that ruled most of the region and its people for over 3 centuries was beginning to lose its imperial grip. The armies, governments, and technology of the globe spanning European empires consistently proved themselves to be far more superior than those of the Muslim Ottomans. This sign of Ottoman decline was growing ever more apparent among the empire's subjects, with resistance and independence movements becoming increasingly common within its borders. From Bulgaria to the north and Egypt to the south, the Ottoman Elayites were beginning to exercise their sovereignty within the framework of European Enlightenment thought. Western methods of governance, militarism, and education were quickly undermining the traditional institutions of the Ottoman Empire, who too wished to see their realm reform into a more westernized and thus modernized nation. As popular as Western Enlightenment thinking was, however, it had failed to reach the citizens of the Arabian Peninsula, the birthplace of the Islamic faith. The social and political fabric of Arabia did not change much under Ottoman rule, with the Sharifate of Mecca and the Banu Hashim tribe remaining to be the guardians of the two holy cities. With the protection of the Ottoman army, the Sharifate was able to assert its authority over the Arab tribes of the Hejaz and the Nejd. Meaning highlands, the Nejd is a plateau region that sits at the center of the peninsula, where many nomadic Bedouin tribes reside in isolation from the influence of major imperial powers. In the small date town of Diriyah, the local emir, Muhammad ibn Saud, allied himself with a religious zealot named Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab. Al-Wahhab championed a revivalist school of Islamic theology that called for Muslims to practice their religion the same way their founding fathers did. This Salafist branch of Islamic thinking, later called Wahhabism, was not very popular with most Arabian tribes due to its extremely orthodox perspective and harsh punishments. In need of protection, Al-Wahhab partnered with bin Saud in his efforts to control the Nejd and reinvigorate what they believed to be the correct standard of Islam. Together, the Saudi-Wahhabist alliance would consolidate their influence in the Nejd, with the Saudi emirs being the political head and the Wahhabist clerics maintaining the moral structure of the Confederation society. Under the rule of Saud ibn Abdulaziz, the Emirate of Diriyah would reach its territorial peak, obtaining much of the Arabian Peninsula and capturing the two holy cities from the Ottoman Empire. In an effort to cleanse their divine territory from heathens, the Saudi Wahhabist state persecuted everyone who did not follow their rigid interpretation of Islam. The Wahhabists raided and destroyed the tombs of Muslim saints like Hussein ibn Ali and prevented the subjects of the Ottoman Empire from performing Hajj, which angered the vast majority of Muslims across the world. The Saudi occupation of the Hejaz was a major blow to the Ottoman Empire, as they had lost possession of the holy cities after being their custodians for nearly 300 years. Though successful in expelling the Saudis from the Hejaz, Ottoman forces were still unable to quash the emirate from the Nejd, where they would continue to rule until the late 1800s. Along with the Hejaz, Muhammad Ali's forces also attempted to bring Yemen into Egyptian control. Although the once powerful Mutawakkil dynasty was at this point deteriorating, the region of Yemen remained to be a highly valuable location on the international stage. The port cities of Aden and Mocha were world famous for their coffee exports, of which European and American merchants consistently competed for. Though unable to penetrate the mountains of Yemen, Muhammad Ali's forces were able to occupy the coastal cities, which strengthened their hold on Red Sea commerce. The British, who feared a potential competitor in their Indian Sea commerce and security, saw this advance by Egypt as a threat. You see, by the 1830s, Muhammad Ali's Egypt was industrializing at a pace that no other nation had ever witnessed before, with a military, government, and manufacturing sector equivalent to that of a common European state. With subsequent victories in Sudan, the Levant, and Arabia, the British feared that this new Egyptian powerhouse would threaten their hegemony over the Indian Ocean, especially since Muhammad Ali had established a good relationship with their French rivals. The southern ports of Yemen were thus an imperative for the British to control, with Captain Haynes of the British Navy arguing that Aden's strategic position would not only consolidate a good portion of the coffee trade, but also be a perfect transshipment station for vessels trading African, Arabian, and Indian goods. After failing to negotiate the purchase of Aden's port from the Abdali Sultan, Haynes proposed that the use of force was the only way to obtain the city. On the 19th of January, 1839, the British Navy and Marines captured Aden and began to consolidate potential tribal allies in the region. Some of these tribes, like the Sultanate of Lahej, allied themselves with the British in order to ensure protection from the Egyptians, directing their coffee trade towards Aden, which would be taxed and shipped by the British Empire. During the same year in July, Britain's ally, the Ottomans, attempted to regain territories in the Levant it had lost to Egypt during the First Ottoman-Turkish War. However, after having suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Egyptians in the Battle of Nazib, the Ottoman army was in shambles and once again in threat of being overthrown by the Egyptians. Coming to the aid of the Ottomans, the Austrian, British, Prussian, and Russian empires intervened in the conflict. The Austrian and British navies created a blockade in the eastern Mediterranean and bombarded the cities of Acre, Beirut, and Sedan. By November of 1840, Egypt was forced by the great powers to sign an agreement that maintained the Khedive's rule over Egypt and Sudan while withdrawing from the Levant and Arabia. With Egypt under control, the Ottomans could now try to reconcile their Arabian holdings, including Yemen. In 1849, the Ottomans entered the port city of Al-Hudaydah and demanded that the ruling Imam al-Mutawakkil Muhammad surrender his kingdom to be a vassal of the empire. Although at first hesitant, the Imam eventually agreed to place his kingdom under the subordination of the empire in exchange for protection and financial compensation. When the Imam and the Ottoman army arrived in Sana'a to announce the new arrangement, the residents revolted, slaughtering the Turkish army and imprisoning the Imam. With political instability in Yemen and the Suez Canal having been opened in 1869, the Ottomans initiated another military campaign to North Yemen. By 1872, many Yemeni tribesmen and sheikhs had become fed up with the Imams, inviting the Ottoman forces to provide some semblance of stability and incorporate Yemen into the empire. The Imamate would continue to be the governing authority of the region, but Yemen was an official province of the empire, with Ottoman troops garrisoned in the capital of Sana'a. However, the presence of Ottoman soldiers and the administration of the province angered many of the locals. Turkish soldiers were seen being drunk on wine, fornicating with men, and disrespecting Sana'a's nobles. Starting in 1891, a series of revolts from the Zaidi population called for their independence from the Ottomans. In 1904, the newly appointed Imam, Yahya Muhammad Hamid ad-Din, continued to rebel against the Ottomans, killing thousands of their soldiers. Throughout the first decade of the 1900s, Imam Yahya would pressure Ottoman diplomats to grant Yemen independence, but the empire would continue to stubbornly make minimal concessions in an attempt to maintain Yemen's status as a province. In 1911, the Imam signed the Treaty of Aden, which granted the Imamate more autonomy, disbanding the Ottoman civil code and reinstating Sharia as the law of the land. Between 1913 and 1914, the Ottoman Empire and Britain signed an agreement that determined the borders of their respective Yemens. However, with the commencement of the First World War, these borders would become bloodied. The Ottoman forces, allied with Imam Yahya, captured the city of Aden in 1915, denying the British access to their South Arabian colony. For the first 2 years of the Middle East theater, the Ottomans had secured solid victories against the British, propagating their accomplishments to Muslims across the world in order to inspire a jihad against their British and Russian oppressors. To avoid colonial insurrections, the British turned to the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, to perform a counter-call to the Ottoman jihad. Prior to the war, the Sharifs of Mecca were already discussing a potential alliance with the British in order to counter the influence of the Ottomans, who had been centralizing their authority in the Hijaz with the construction of railroads and telegraph lines. The British were reluctant to join the Sharifs at first due to their favorable relations with the Ottomans, but with the Turks now threatening the stability of their Muslim colonies, the English needed to find allies within the Islamic world to counter any calls for jihad. Being the custodian of the two holy cities and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, Sharif Hussein was the perfect candidate for a counter-jihad against the Ottomans. In exchange for his loyalty, the British promised the Sharif an independent Arab state that would rule what is now modern-day Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and the Hijaz. Along with the Hashemites, the British also signed a treaty with the tribe of Al Saud, who continued to rule a small emirate in the town of Riyadh. The Saudis and their Wahhabist Ikhwan warriors would contest with the Ottoman-aligned Rashid tribes of the Nejd keeping all that they have conquered. Though both against the Ottoman forces, the Hashemites and the Saudis were bitter rivals, as they both challenged each other for territory and religious legitimacy within Arabia. In 1916, the Arabs, aided by the British and French, began to revolt against the Ottomans, successfully sabotaging their Hijazi railroad and telegraph networks. With the Ottoman troops in Yemen being isolated by the successful campaigns of the Arabs, Imam Yahya decided to take advantage of the situation and consolidate his power in North Yemen. In 1918, the Imamate of North Yemen declared itself to be independent from the Ottomans, who had suffered defeat by the Allies and their Arab proxies. In a backstabbing twist that would forever be infamous in world history, the British and French denied the Arab state they promised to Sharif Hussein, instead carving out the Fertile Crescent for their own imperial gains. In response to their broken promises, Hussein would distance himself from the British, condemning their intent in delivering Syria to the French and Palestine to Zionists. In 1921, during the Cairo Convention, the English decided to allow the sons of Hussein, Abdullah and Faisal, to rule the British territories of Transjordan and Iraq as monarchs, in an effort to soften relations with the Hashemites. However, the brutal suppression of Arab demonstrators and the continuation of French and Zionist colonialism continued to irritate the Sharif, who even refused to recognize the British mandates his sons ruled due to his principles. Hussein's sons, aware of the Sharifat's weakness and dependency on British protection, tried to persuade their father in accepting the terms of the English, but the stubborn king remained firm on his condition that no treaty with the British would ever be signed until they guaranteed his kingship over the lands he was promised. Although popular among many Arab nationals due to his pan-Arabist ideals, Sharif Hussein was not popular among many Muslim revivalists, and in particular, a certain Muhammad Rashid Rida. Being a student of the famous Salafist scholar Muhammad Abdu, Rida advocated for the establishment of a united pan-Islamic state. Although at first a supporter of the Sharif's Arab revolt, the close relations and dependency on the British and other Western powers suggested to Rida that the Hashemites were not competent or pious enough to rule the Islamic world as its caliph. Thus, he began to call for the Hijaz and the holy cities to be taken by a leader who was worthy of championing a pan-Islamic cause. That champion would be Abdulaziz ibn Saud. At this time, Ibn Saud and his Ikhwan warriors were expanding their territories in Arabia, claiming all Muslims who did not follow their Wahhabist brand were infidels who could be justifiably attacked. By the 1920s, the raiding parties of the Ikhwan were beginning to affect British protectorates in Arabia, and with the Sharif of Mecca proving to be uncooperative, the British decided to negotiate with the Saudis. In agreeing to recognize the territorial integrity of the British mandates and protectorates, the Saudis turned their attention to the Hijaz, as Sharif Hussein and his son Ali had declared themselves to be the caliphs of the Islamic world. Although the British often came to the aid of the Hashemites against the Saudis in prior confrontations, the recent animosity of Sharif Hussein encouraged the English to turn a blind eye to the Saudi advancements. By 1926, the Hijaz and the two holy cities were captured and incorporated into Saudi territory, becoming internationally recognized as the Kingdom of the Hijaz and Najd the following year. By 1926, the protectorates of Britain shared the Arabian Peninsula with the Saudis, the Mutawakkil Kingdom, and the small emirate of Asir, which lay between the latter two. Founded in 1906, the Emirate of Asir was established by a Sufi scholar named Muhammad ibn Ali al-Idrisid, who was the great-grandson of Ahmed ibn Idrisid al-Fasi, a Moroccan scholar who founded the Idrisid Sufi order. Dissatisfied with the impious and corrupted rule of the Ottomans, al-Idrisid sought to establish law and order in a region that was in near anarchy. In 1909, after becoming renowned for his arbitration and teachings, al-Idrisid established an independent government and resisted Ottoman forces in order to preserve his new emirate. Though both adversaries of the Ottomans, al-Idrisid and Imam Yahya were bitter political and theological rivals. The Emirate of Asir found an ally in the Italian colonial empire, supporting their efforts in the Turco-Italian War against the Ottomans. With the outbreak of the First World War, the British also found a willing ally in Asir, participating in the Arab Revolt. After the war, the British handed the Asir Emirate the port city of Hodeidah, which Imam Yahya claimed was rightfully part of his Imamate, as it was the only major port in the territory. Between 1919 and 1923, the Emirate of Asir would battle the Zaidi Imamate with the support of British arms. After the death of Muhammad al-Idrisid, his son Ali was elected to be the new emir, but not without controversy. Ali was young and seen as easily to manipulate by the Italians, so many of his family members challenged his rule, claiming to be the emir of different parts of the already small emirate. The disunity of the emirate allowed for Imam Yahya to take al-Hodeidah in 1925, attracting the attention of the Italians who needed the port for their East African ventures. The Imamate had an isolationist foreign policy and a deep distrust of the Europeans, but being surrounded by adversaries forced the kingdom to consider allies and trading partners. So in 1926, Italy would sign a treaty with the Imamate, recognizing Yahya's authority as the king of Yemen, which included his claims over Aden. With Imam Yahya pressuring British holdings in Aden and now becoming friends of Mussolini's Italy, the kingdom posed a threat to English interests in the Red Sea. Negotiating with the Italians, the British decided to stay neutral in the Idrisid-Zaidi conflict, so as not to jeopardize any potential arrangements. This made the Idrisids, who were still in the midst of an internal conflict, vulnerable to not just the Yemeni Imamate, but also the emerging Saudis. Knowing that the Idrisids could not stand a chance against the Imamate, the British assigned the protection of the much contested Khorasan Islands to the Saudis in order to ensure future relations. The brother of Ali al-Idrisid, Hassan, sought to claim the Idrisid throne for himself and needed the support of the Saudis to ensure his rule. Thus, in 1926, a treaty was signed that ensured Hassan's domestic rule of Asir while making the emirate a protectorate of the Saudis. However, in 1930, Abdulaziz announced the complete annexation of Asir, forcing Hassan to give up much of his power. Though the Saudis were considered to be the guardians of the two holy mosques, many Muslims opposed the custodian of their holy sites to be in the hands of such fanatics. Thus, in 1932, the same year that the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was announced, rebels from all over the Muslim world attempted to liberate the Hijaz from the newly formed kingdom. Many of these rebels hid in Asir under the protection of one of the Idrisid princes, Abd al-Wahhab bin Muhammad, who saw this conflict as an opportunity to re-establish the emirate's independence. However, Hassan al-Idrisid remained loyal to the Saudis and fought against the efforts of his brother. The Saudis quashed the rebellion and in the process ousted the Idrisids, who continued to receive pension from the kingdom in exchange for their absence in politics. By 1933, Asir was fully incorporated into the Saudi kingdom, and there was now a border between them and the Imamate of Yemen, the only other independent Arab nation. Being bitter rivals, it was inevitable for the two kingdoms to clash. Before engaging in battle, Imam Yahya signed a treaty with the British in February of 1934, recognizing their authority over Aden and establishing somewhat friendly ties. The following month, the Saudis attacked the Imamate, taking control of the cities of Jizan, Najran, and al-Hodeidah. However, attacks in the mountainous terrain proved to be difficult for the Saudis, who settled for peace in May of the same year. A peace treaty was signed in Taif, which granted Yemen back its control of Hodeidah, but maintained that Jizan, Najran, and the entire Asir region remained part of Saudi Arabia, a loss that continues to resonate with many Yemenis today. After the military failure of his kingdom, Imam Yahya sought to create a national army that did not rely on tribal militias of the Hashid and Bakil clans. To do this, he sent students across the Arab world to study and learn military techniques. These educated Yemeni students, usually of the affluent urban classes, were exposed to ideas that were circulating around the Arab world. Ideas of Arabism, socialism, secularism, democracy, and pan-Islamism were inspiring many Yemeni expats to see their ruling imam as isolating and regressing Yemeni society. Cities like Cairo and Aden were hotbeds for these new Yemeni intellectuals, who all fell under the wider association of the Yemeni freedom movement. Although not entirely united on what a future Yemen should look like, the YFM agreed that the powers of the Imam should be limited, if not completely eliminated, if the country was to see true reform. In 1948, rival tribes who claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad orchestrated an attempted coup and the assassination of Imam Yahya. Despite the Imam perishing, the coup was unsuccessful, with Yahya's son, Ahmed, ascending to the throne after a violent month of suppressing dissidents. Another attempted coup would occur in 1955, this time led by one of Yahya's sons, Prince Abdullah, also resulting in failure. Despite the failed coups, the YFM continued to push for change in North Yemen, publishing articles and magazines among their diaspora and communities around the Arab world, calling for reform in Yemen. Imam Ahmed blamed the attempted coups and the assassination of his father on the British, since Aden hosted much of the FYM. He renewed the ambitions of his father in reintegrating South Yemen into a Greater Yemen project. But in order to stand against the British, Ahmed knew he needed to make friends with his fellow Arabs. The 1940s and 50s saw the beginning of decolonialism in the Middle East and Africa. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt overthrew the British-backed Khedive monarchy in 1952 and championed Pan-Arabism as a policy of anti-Western resistance. In 1955, Imam Ahmed signed a defense pact with Egypt and Syria, eventually becoming a member of the short-lived United Arab States Confederacy in 1958. Imam Ahmed also established a friendlier approach with Saudi Arabia, with the kingdom allowing Yemeni immigrants to enter the country without work permits. Saudi Arabia was in need of cheap labor due to its growing oil industry, and the Imamate needed to ensure the security of its northern border so that it could direct all of its efforts in taking over the south. If Saudi Arabia were to ever threaten the Imamate, Egypt and Syria would intervene to ensure its security. Ahmed's son, Muhammad al-Badr, was the crown prince of the Imamate and responsible for much of the kingdom's relationships with the outside world. Al-Badr was a great admirer of Nasser's charisma and was very eager to be armed by the Soviets, who he believed had the capacity to help modernize Yemen. Soviet and Chinese specialists would help develop Yemen's infrastructure and industries, drastically increasing the economic output of the ancient country. Despite the distaste of a theocratic monarchy, Nasser and the Soviets continued to support the Imamate due to al-Badr's wide-eyed admiration and perceived gullibleness. Now, it is important to note here that Nasser was in a way grooming al-Badr to become the new king of Yemen. On multiple occasions, Nasser encouraged al-Badr to overthrow and even kill his father, so that a proper union between the kingdom could be made with Egypt and Syria. However, al-Badr confessed to his father about the intrigue, in which the Imam, in response, encouraged the prince to negotiate a military pact with Jordan and Saudi Arabia. In 1961, an assassination attempt on Imam Ahmed's life left him in a dire state, eventually succumbing to his wounds the following year and leaving al-Badr as Yemen's new king. However, not even a week into his reign as king, al-Badr was overthrown in a coup, with his palace being shelled and destroyed. The over 900-year-old Zaidi Imamate was overthrown in a successful revolution by the YFM, ushering in the establishment of the Yemen Arab Republic. The coup was led by a military commander named Abdullah al-Salal, a respected member of the army who had harbored YFM sympathies since his training in Iraq during the 1930s. Seizing control of the radio stations, the revolutionaries declared the Imam to be dead and called for the establishment of a Republic of the Arabian Peninsula. However, over a month after the takeover, al-Badr was reported alive in Saudi Arabia. Despite the humiliating error of reporting, the Soviet Union and Egypt supported the newly established republic, with Nasser sending soldiers within the first weeks of the YAR's formation. You see, the United Arab Republic that Nasser attempted to maintain with Syria collapsed in 1961, lasting only 3 years and being a diplomatic blunder for Egypt. Nasser saw involvement in Yemen's revolution as an opportunity to reignite political relevance in the Arab world, as well as a way to secure interest in the Red Sea. Legally, Egypt was able to justify its military involvement in Yemen by citing its obligations in the 1956 Jeddah Pact. Saudi Arabia, however, also cited the Jeddah Pact and other agreements to legally host and support the Imamate against the revolutionary takeover. Since they occupied the Zaidi-populated region of Asird and Najran, the Saudis believed that internal turmoil could be avoided if they supported the Imamate, who was popular among the Shia minority. Fighting between the Imamate and Republican supporters raged as the two sides were being armed and supported by rival Arab camps. The Republicans would receive millions of dollars in financial aid from the Soviet Union, who also sent teams of doctors, engineers, and agriculturalists to further develop the new country. The royalists were supported by the kingdoms of Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who feared that the Nasser-led push for pan-Arab republicanism threatened their rule. The British would serve as the royalists' main international backer, while a reluctant United States, who was barely aware of Yemen's existence, tried to serve as a mediator between the two sides. Despite being allies with Jordan and Saudi Arabia, the United States actually recognized the YAR, seeing that there was no way the Imamate, which was unpopular in Yemen, could win the war. Throughout 1962 and 1963, the United States encouraged Egypt and Saudi Arabia to withdraw their troops from Yemen and secure a peace deal. However, due to the great geopolitical weight the conflict had in the Arab world, both sides were stubborn to stay in Yemen, with the Saudis fearful of having their own revolution and the Egyptians knowing that the new republic could not stand on its own militarily. The YAR occupied the majority of the cities and population, but the rural regions were firmly under the influence of royalist tribes, controlling a much larger territory than the former. The royalists only had tribal affiliations and later foreign mercenaries, but with the mountainous terrain, they were able to apply a lot of pressure against the Egyptian army. Though many tribes were loyal to the YAR, few were willing to fight against the royalists, as they were not only terrible soldiers, but also more interested in pillaging local villages, forcing the Egyptians to do the majority of the fighting. Being trained for desert combat, the mountains proved to be a difficult place for the Egyptian army to hold, as tribal militias utilized effective guerrilla tactics to their advantage. This led to massive losses on the Egyptian side, which only encouraged Nasser to keep sending more troops and weapons to the war, with indiscriminate airstrikes being a common occurrence. While politically Egypt was interested in supporting the establishment of the Yemeni Republic, the Egyptians themselves were quite hostile to the Yemeni people in general. During the mission, Egyptian soldiers were seen abusing and humiliating Yemeni civilians, treating them more as animals than actual allies. However, this abuse towards the Yemeni people by the Egyptian army would not come without repercussions. The guerrillas were known to be especially ruthless in their terror tactics, sending back the ears, lips, and noses of Egyptian soldiers as gifts to the revolutionaries. By 1964, many of the revolutionaries began to resent Egyptian occupation and Salal's leadership, wishing to establish a third force in Yemen's political arena. One of these activists was Mohammed Mahmoud al-Zubairi. Al-Zubairi was a prominent political figure of the YFM and considered by many Yemenis to be the greatest poet of the 20th century. Involved in revolutionary affairs since the 40s, al-Zubairi became the Minister of Education and later Deputy Prime Minister of the Yemeni Republic. However, with the war dragging on with no end in sight, al-Zubairi, along with his colleagues Ahmed Numan and Abdel al-Rahman al-Irani, began to form their own political alternative. As the third force, al-Zubairi and his allies conducted secret negotiations with royalists and tribal leaders to discuss the removal of Salal's government and end the Egyptian occupation. Seeing this as a threat to their mission, the Egyptians assassinated al-Zubairi in 1965, sparking outrage among the Hashid and Bakil tribes. The massive coalition of al-Zubairi supporters threatened to invade Sana'a, prompting Salal to appoint Ahmed Numan as deputy prime minister as a way to soften dissent. With the third force in the halls of government, negotiations seeking to limit Salal's power and establish Yemen as an Islamic republic continued, but with little concessions being made. This brash decision to assassinate al-Zubairi only put more pressure on Egypt's political standing in Yemen. So in 1965, a meeting was held in Jeddah to ensure an eventual withdrawal of Egyptian troops and Saudi support. However, with Salal's government growing increasingly unpopular, the Egyptians backed out of their promise of withdrawing by 1966. Saudi Arabia also did not see a reason to maintain this side of the agreement. Thus, a Saudi alliance with Iran was further cemented in order to counter Arab nationalists, and the kingdom began to sign military contracts with the UK and US worth nearly $500 million. Despite both calling for an end to the war publicly, the USSR and US both incentivized Nasser to continue his occupation of Yemen. The USSR had already invested funds and personnel to help develop the YAR into their sphere of influence. Thus, maintaining the pro-Soviet republic was of strategic importance. The United States had a similar approach in viewing Yemen's disaster as a great opportunity for American aid agencies. Though mostly siding with the Saudis, and having experienced several confrontations with Egyptian soldiers, the United States continued to aid Egypt with wheat and funding, allowing them to continue the occupation. In a conversation with King Faisal, President Lyndon Johnson assured the Saudi monarch of America's foreign policy interests by saying, "On its present course, the UAR is gaining little, losing much in Yemen. UAR problems are many. Yemen's drain on UAR resources is great. UAR is not winning popular support among the people. Yemen can well prove to be a trap for those who would seek to dominate it." By keeping Egypt occupied in Yemen, the United States and their allies in the region could contain Nasser's ambitions. With a good chunk of the Egyptian army and air force in Yemen, Nasser was unable to properly confront Israel the way many of his allies and supporters wanted him to. Desperate to compel the royalists, the Egyptians relied on indiscriminate bombings and in 1967 began to utilize chemical weapons in order to fulfill a more effective scorched earth policy. Despite being universally agreed upon as illegal, the usage of chemical weapons by Egypt faced little international backlash, mostly due to the fact that the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, was also engaging in similar atrocities in Vietnam. Egypt's allies across the decolonizing world and the Soviet sphere were unwilling to put any real diplomatic pressure against these atrocities, and the Western Front was morally bankrupt to impose any consequences. This led to Egypt's use of chemical weapons in Yemen to be more or less unchallenged, leading to the deaths of thousands of Yemeni civilians. The use of chemical weapons only grew more frequent with Israel's surprise invasion of Egypt, which forced much of the munitions and armies stationed in Yemen to be deployed in the Sinai. With royalist forces taking advantage of the withdrawal, the Egyptians became more reliant upon chemical weapons and indiscriminate bombings to hold off enemy attacks. The humiliation of Egypt in the Six-Day War and continued crimes against the Yemeni public had at this point made an Egyptian victory impossible. In August of 1967, Saudi Arabia agreed to meet with Nasser in Sudan to discuss a mutual withdrawal and end to the war. The agreement would see Saudi Arabia provide financial aid to Egypt after suffering from its crushing defeat at the hands of the Israelis. In October of the same year, Egypt released political prisoners who would later provide the final blow to Nasser's Yemen project just a month later. On November 5th of 1967, Third Force forces, supported by much of the Yemeni public, overthrew Salal in a bloodless coup. The following weeks saw Egyptian forces withdraw from Yemen, leading to al-Badr's coalition of tribes and royalists to lay siege to the capital of Sana'a. 1968 saw the royalists attempt to starve out Sana'a and the Republican forces, but with aid from the Soviet Union, the tribal forces of the Imamate crumbled, leaving the Yemeni Republic to remain as the official government of North Yemen. Though some skirmishes would continue after the failed siege, the YAR emerged as the last government standing, having successfully repelled the efforts of the royalists and removed the Egyptians from the country.